The first thing I remember about the wake is the smell of casseroles. Not grief, not flowers, not even the wax of the candles my aunt had set out on the kitchen island in a row, the way our mother used to do at Easter. It was that warm, layered smell of green bean casserole and tuna noodle, and the sweet potato thing my cousin Marlene always brought, all of it sitting under cling film on the long pine kitchen island in my mother's house, the house I had grown up in, the house that sat in the middle of 22 acres of Pinot Noir vines, off a gravel road outside Dundee, Oregon. It was the third Saturday of August. The afternoon light was coming in low and yellow through the south-facing windows, falling across the worn pine floor in long, slow rectangles, and the whole room smelled like other people's cooking, and my mother had been dead for 4 days. I was 49 years old. My name does not matter for this story. What matters is that I was standing alone at that kitchen island with a paper cup of black coffee in my hand, and my younger sister was standing across the room near the fireplace in a charcoal pantsuit and a cream silk blouse, and she would not look at me. She was 44. She lived in Portland. She drove a leased German sedan and worked in commercial real estate, and wore her ash blonde hair cut sharp at the jaw. And from the moment she had walked through the front door of our mother's farmhouse 2 days earlier, she had not once met my eyes. I had told myself, the way an older sister tells herself a great many useful lies, that she was simply grieving in her own way, that we processed loss differently, that she would soften by the funeral, or by the wake, or by the time the casseroles came out. She did not soften. She was, in fact, working the room. I watched her move from our father's old college roommate to our mother's 2 surviving cousins, to the woman who had owned the feed store in Dundee for 35 years. And I watched the way she touched their forearms when she spoke, the way she leaned in, the way she lowered her voice. Every person she spoke to, after a few minutes, would glance across the kitchen island at me, and then look quickly away. By the time the sun had moved another inch across the floor, I understood that something was happening in my mother's house that I did not yet have the shape of. I set the paper cup down on the island and walked over to her. "Hey," I said quietly, "can we talk for a minute, outside?" She looked at me then for the first time since she had arrived. Her pale blue eyes were perfectly dry. There was a small, cold curve at the corner of her mouth that I had last seen when she was 9 years old and had broken the lid of our mother's good casserole dish and convinced our mother I had done it. "I don't think we have anything to discuss in private," she said. Her voice was even. It was pitched, very deliberately, to carry. The whole kitchen went still. I felt my face go hot. The thing about being the older sister, the quiet sister, the one who stays on the land and works the vines and answers the phone when our mother needs a ride to the doctor at 6 a.m, is that you spend your entire life learning not to make a scene. You learn it in the body. You learn it the way some people learn to ride a bicycle. By 49, I had 30 years of practice in not making a scene. And so I did not. I stood there with my hands open at my sides, and I waited. "You took it," she said, loud enough now that the man by the fireplace turned. "You took it out of Mom's safe." "Took what?" "You know what?" "No," I said, and my voice, to my own surprise, was perfectly steady. "I don't." "The will," my sister said. "Mom's will. The handwritten one. It's gone. I checked the safe this morning. You were the only one with the combination. It's gone, and we both know where it is." There is a particular kind of silence that drops onto a room of people who are already half drunk on grief and bad coffee, and that silence dropped onto my mother's kitchen at exactly that moment. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I could hear a meadowlark out in the south block. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, a slow, heavy thud like something falling downstairs. "That isn't true," I said. "It is true. I have not opened that safe since Mom went into hospice." "Then explain why it's gone." "I can't explain why it's gone because I don't know that it's gone. I haven't looked in the safe." Convenient. The word landed in the room like a glass dropped on tile. I watched my cousin Marlene set down her plate. I watched the woman from the feed store fold her arms across her chest. I watched my mother's two cousins, who had loved her since they were all children together in the 1950s, take half a step closer to my sister and away from me, and I understood, in a kind of slow, cold clarity, that the room had already decided. It had decided 2 days ago. While I was sitting in the funeral director's office, picking out a casket and a hymn, my sister had been here, in this house, telling these people a story. She had been working them. "I don't want to fight at Mom's wake," I said. My voice was beginning to shake now, and I hated that, but I could not stop it. "I just want to know what it is you think I did. I think you went into Mom's safe sometime in the last week, and you took the original handwritten will because you didn't like what it said," my sister told the room. Because that, I understood now, was who she was talking to. Not me. Never me. "I think the version that's about to be probated is a version that benefits you. I think Mom changed her mind in the last 6 months. I think we all know she changed her mind. And I think you took the original because you couldn't stand the thought of losing this house." "Mom did not change her mind." "Then where is it?" "I don't know where it is because I have not been in the safe." "Then open the safe right now," she said, "in front of all of us, and let's see what's in there." I opened my mouth and then I closed it again, because there was no answer to that demand that would not make me look guilty. If I refused, I was hiding something. If I agreed, and the will was indeed gone, then I had been the only one with the combination, and the room had already decided what that meant. My sister had cornered me, in my mother's kitchen, in front of every person whose opinion of me mattered in this valley, and she had done it on the day of the wake, when no one's nervous system was working at full strength, and she had done it well. I will say this for her. She had always been good at this. "Fine," I said. The whole room came with us. The safe was a small wall safe, set behind a framed black and white photograph of my grandmother in the front parlor. My mother had had it installed in 1998 after a string of break-ins along our road, and the only people in the world who had ever known the combination were my mother, my late father, and me. She had given it to me in the spring, the week she was diagnosed, sitting at this same kitchen island, sliding a piece of folded notepaper across the wood with 2 thin, trembling fingers and saying quietly, "Only you, sweetheart. Only you." I lifted the photograph off the wall. The dial was cold under my fingers. 12 right, 34 left, 6 right. The little tumblers fell into place with a soft mechanical click that I had not heard in months, and the small steel door swung open into the dim parlor light. There was an envelope on the top shelf. There was an envelope and a small velvet box that contained my grandmother's wedding rings, and a brown accordion folder of property deeds going back to my great-grandfather, and a thin sheaf of U.S. savings bonds from the 1970s. There was also, my sister announced from over my shoulder, with a kind of soft, triumphant note in her voice, an empty space where the original handwritten will should have been. "I told you," she said, to the room, Not to me. I took the envelope out. It was thick, cream-colored, heavy. The flap was sealed, but not with wax. My mother's handwriting was on the front in her careful Catholic school cursive. For my daughters in the event. That was all it said. That's not it, my sister said immediately. That's just a letter. Where's the will? I don't know. You don't know. I have not been in this safe since April. Then explain to me how the will is gone. I cannot explain to you how the will is gone, because I do not know. She turned to the room, her hands lifted slightly, palms up, in a perfect small gesture of helpless reasonableness. And I watched the people who had known me my entire life. The woman from the feed store, my mother's cousin Doris, my own godfather. I watched them tilt, one by one, away from me. I think we all know what happened here, she said quietly. I think my sister has had a very hard time accepting that Mom wanted things to be fair this time. I think she went into this safe, and she took the will because she could not bear the thought of splitting this property in half. And I think, for the sake of our mother's memory, we should not let her get away with this. I have been told, by people who have read more about these things than I have, that there is a moment in any public shaming when the body simply forgets how to stand. Mine did. I felt my knees go soft. I put my hand against the parlor wall. I looked down at the envelope in my hand, and I tried to make sense of my mother's handwriting on the front of it, and the cursive blurred and re-blurred as I blinked. I have not done this, I said, to the room, to no one. No one answered. My godfather was the first to leave. He patted my arm as he went past, the way you pat a dog you no longer trust, and he murmured something about getting on the road before dark. The woman from the feed store left next, then Doris, then the cousins, then my own husband, and I will be honest with you, telling this part still costs me, my own husband, who had watched the whole thing in a kind of frozen confusion from the doorway of the parlor, walked back into the kitchen and started gathering up our coats. He believed me. I want to say that first. He believed me. But he did not know how to fight a whole room on the day of his mother-in-law's wake, and he was tired, and he wanted to take me home. I left my mother's house that afternoon with a sealed envelope in my hand, and the certainty written into every face I passed that I had stolen from a dead woman. My sister did not say goodbye. She stood in the doorway of the front parlor, framed by the late August light, her ash-blonde hair perfectly smooth at the jaw, and she watched me walk to the truck. There was no triumph on her face. That is what I want you to understand. There was nothing on her face at all. It was the most frightening thing I had ever seen. We drove home the long way, my husband and I, along the gravel road that runs the length of the South Block, past the row of old walnut trees my father had planted the year I was born, and I did not cry. I sat with the envelope on my lap and watched the late summer dust rise behind us in the side mirror, and I tried to understand what had just happened. I want to tell you quickly what was in the envelope, because I think it matters. It was not the will. It was a letter from my mother, written in the careful, slow handwriting of a woman who has begun to suspect she is dying. It was 4 pages long. It said the things mothers say when they think they may not be able to say them later, that she was proud of me, that she knew the vineyard had cost me a great deal, that she knew my sister had not been kind. It said, near the end, in a sentence that I would come back to many times in the 3 weeks that followed, do not be afraid to let the lawyer do his work. He knows what I have asked him to do. That was all. I read it 3 times. Then I folded it, very carefully, and I put it back in its envelope. and I put the envelope in the locked drawer of the roll-top desk in our spare bedroom. And I went to bed at 7 o'clock in the evening with all my clothes on, and I did not get up again until the following Tuesday. I want to walk you through what those next 3 weeks were like, because if you have ever been on the wrong side of a story your own family has decided to believe, you will recognize the shape of it. The phone calls stopped first. My godfather did not call. My mother's cousins did not call. The woman from the feed store, who had been bringing my mother loaves of cinnamon bread every Christmas for 20 years, walked past me at the grocery store in McMinnville on a Wednesday morning and pretended she had not seen me, and I stood in the cereal aisle with a box of Cheerios in my hand, and I cried, very quietly, into my own forearm. The Vines did not care, of course. The Vines wanted what they always wanted in the 3rd week of August. They wanted me out among them at 5:30 in the morning, checking sugar levels. They wanted me in the South Block, tying up the canes that the wind had loosened. They wanted me at the cellar door at sundown, closing the heavy bolt against raccoons. And so I gave them what they wanted, because I did not know what else to do with my hands. My husband worked beside me without speaking. We had been married for 26 years. He knew that what I needed in those 3 weeks was not words. What I needed was for someone to keep showing up at the end of the row. My sister, meanwhile, made her case. I will not pretend I know everything she did. I know she filed a formal contest with the probate court in Yamhill County. I know she retained a lawyer in Portland, an aggressive woman with a downtown address and a website full of testimonials. I know she gave a long, careful interview to my mother's pastor, in which she described, with great sorrow, her older sister's history of resentment and her recent cooling toward the family. I know she had the locks changed on my mother's farmhouse. I know she did this on a Thursday afternoon while I was in the South Block with my back to the road, and I know the locksmith had been told not to mention it to me. I learned about the locks from my husband, who learned about them from the locksmith's wife at the post office. I want to talk for a moment about what it is like to be accused in a small valley of stealing from a dead mother. I have never been good at language for these things, but I will try. It is, first of all, a kind of low, constant nausea. You wake up at 4 in the morning with it. It is in your jaw, in your shoulders, in the small bones at the back of your neck. You sit up in the dark, and you listen to your husband breathing beside you, and you cannot remember, for a long, slow second, why you feel as bad as you do. And then it comes back to you in one piece, the way a dream comes back, and you sit there in the dark of the spare bedroom with your hand on your sternum, and you breathe through it. 5 seconds in, 7 seconds out. The way the woman on the meditation app teaches you. It does not help. You do it anyway, because it is something to do. It is, secondly, a kind of constant rehearsal. You spend the entire day in your own head defending yourself to people who are not present. You explain to the woman from the feed store exactly when you last opened the safe and exactly what was in it. You explain to your godfather that you would never. You explain to your mother's 2 cousins that there has been a misunderstanding. You explain to your own dead mother that you would not have done this, that you did not do this, that you have never in your life done this. Hours of explanation, all of it inside your own skull, all of it to people who would not, if they were in the same room, listen to a word of it. It is, thirdly, the strange particular grief of being unable to grieve. My mother had been dead for less than a week when my sister stood up at the kitchen island and called me a thief. I had not yet even understood, in any settled way, that my mother was gone. She had been the central fact of my life for 49 years, and I had not yet sat with the absence of her for a single uninterrupted hour, and now I would not be allowed to sit with it for a long time, because I had to spend the next 3 weeks of my life proving that I had not stolen from her on the day of her wake. I lost my mother and the right to grieve my mother in the same 48 hours. I do not know that I will ever entirely forgive my sister for that. I do not know that I am required to. The vines were the only kindness I knew how to receive in those weeks. The vines did not ask me what had happened in my mother's kitchen. The vines did not call me to ask if I was holding up. The vines wanted what they always wanted in late August, which was to be tended, and so I tended them. I rose at 5:15 in the morning. I drank a cup of black coffee at the kitchen counter standing up. I pulled on my brown leather work boots and my faded denim jacket, and I went out to the south block before the sun was over the eastern ridge, and I walked the rows. I checked sugar levels with the small refractometer my father had given me on my 30th birthday. I tied up canes the wind had loosened. I pulled a few leaves from the canopy at the southern edge of row 12, where the morning sun was getting in too hard. I noticed, as I always did at this time of year, the difference in the weight of the fruit between the head of the row and the foot, the way the grapes near the gravel turnaround were always slightly looser and slightly smaller because of the way the wind moved over the rise. I wrote down what I noticed in the small green notebook I kept in my back pocket. I had been keeping that notebook every August for 30 years. My mother had kept hers for 40. I did not call anyone. I did not answer my phone, except when it was my husband or the lawyer's office or a vendor. I did not go into McMinnville except when I had to. I did not go to the grocery store in Dundee at all that whole month. I bought what we needed at the small co-op in Carleton, where nobody had heard yet, and I drove the long way home along the river road so that I would not have to pass my mother's farmhouse with its newly changed locks. I did, in those 3 weeks, 2 things that I am proud of and that I want to mention, because if you are ever in a position like the one I was in, I want you to know that small acts matter. The first was that I wrote a letter by hand on plain unlined paper to every person who had been in my mother's kitchen on the day of the wake. I did not defend myself in those letters. I did not accuse my sister. I simply told them, in 2 short paragraphs each, that I had loved my mother very much, that I was sorry for what they had been put through that afternoon, and that whatever they came to believe about me in the weeks ahead, I hoped they would remember that my mother had loved them and had wanted them in her kitchen at the end. I signed each letter and I stamped each envelope, and I drove out to the post office in Dundee at 6:30 in the evening, when I knew the lobby would be empty, and I dropped them through the slot one by one, and I came home and I did not cry. I did not hear back from any of them. That was all right. The letters had not been written to be answered. The second was that I kept the books of the vineyard every single day, exactly the way I had kept them when my mother was alive. I logged the hours of the 2 seasonal hands. I reconciled the previous month's sales against the wholesaler's statements. I paid the water bill, the electricity bill, the property tax bill, the small remaining balance on the equipment loan from 2021. I did all of this knowing that my sister in those weeks was telling people I had stolen from our mother. I did all of it because I knew, in a way I cannot fully explain, that there would come a day, perhaps soon, perhaps not soon, when someone official would ask to see the books, and I wanted on that day to slide a clean ledger across a desk and say there, every dollar, from the day she went into hospice, every dollar accounted for, in her own daughter's hand. That day came, in fact, in the second week of September, in a Portland conference room with my sister's attorney sitting across the table. The lawyer had warned me that the contest filing required us to provide an interim accounting of the estate within 30 days, and so we provided one, 12 pages, single-spaced, with every receipt and every reconciliation appended. My sister's attorney looked at it for a long time without speaking. She did not ask a single question. She put it back into its folder. She did not bring it up again. I want to tell you that the books, in the end, mattered. They mattered the way a clean shirt matters at a job interview. They did not win the case. The codicil won the case. But they made it impossible to argue that I had ever, even for a day, behaved like a person who had something to hide. I drove out to the farmhouse the following morning. I sat in the truck on the gravel turnaround for a long time, looking at the porch where my mother had sat with her coffee every morning for 40 years, looking at the wisteria she had trained up the south corner, looking at the weathered red barn and the rows of vines stretching down toward the creek. And I understood, with a kind of slow, heavy understanding, that I had been locked out of the only place on earth that had ever felt like mine. I did not get out of the truck. I drove home. That was the second week. In the third week, on a Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. The number was a Yamhill County number I did not recognize. I almost did not answer it. I had begun by then to flinch every time the phone rang, but I answered it, and a careful, courteous male voice on the other end said my name and asked if I had a moment. It was the lawyer. I should explain. My mother's estate lawyer was a man named, well, his name does not matter for this story either. What matters is that he was 65 years old, that he had gone to college with my mother in the late 1970s at Willamette University in Salem, and that he had been her closest friend, after my father, for the entirety of my life. He had been at my baptism. He had been at her hospice bed. He had helped her, the spring of her diagnosis, draft the papers I would now spend 3 weeks being accused of stealing. He asked me, on the phone that Tuesday afternoon, if I could come to his office on Thursday morning. He said it was important. He said he would prefer that I come alone, although my husband was welcome if I needed him. He said very carefully that there were some things he wanted to put on the record with me directly before he put them on the record with anyone else. I said yes. I drove into McMinnville on Thursday morning in my husband's pickup because the alternator on my truck had finally given out, and I parked on 3rd Street, and I sat in the cab for 10 minutes before I could make myself go in. His office was on the 2nd floor of a 1910 brick building above what used to be a stationery store. The stairs were steep. The hallway smelled like old wood and lemon polish. The frosted glass door at the end of the hall had his name in gold leaf, and I stood in front of that door for another half a minute before I knocked. He opened it himself. He was exactly as I remembered him. Lean, upright silver hair parted on the left, kind gray-blue eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses, a soft brown tweed sport coat over a button-down shirt and a dark wool tie. There was a fountain pen clipped to his breast pocket. He took my hand in both of his when I came in, and he did not say, "I am sorry for your loss," because he knew I had heard that sentence from too many wrong mouths in the last 3 weeks. He said instead, "Come in, dear. Sit down. I have something I need to read to you." His office was small. There was a wooden desk under a window that looked down onto 3rd Street, 2 leather chairs in front of the desk, a green glass banker's lamp lit against the gray late summer light, and a wall of legal volumes behind him in dark cloth bindings. The desk was almost bare. There was a yellow legal pad. There was the fountain pen. there was a small white china cup of coffee. And in the middle of the desk, on a square of dark blue felt, there was an envelope. I noticed the envelope first. It was a heavy cream envelope, almost square, and it was sealed across the flap with a disc of dark red wax. There was an impression in the wax. I could not see, from where I sat, what the impression was. The envelope was addressed in fountain pen ink, in a careful old-fashioned hand that was not my mother's, and there was a small adhesive evidence label affixed to the lower left corner in the careful neutral type of a county clerk. He sat down behind the desk. He folded his hands on the blotter. He looked at me for a long moment over the rims of his tortoiseshell glasses, and then he said, very quietly, "I owe you an apology before we begin." "You don't owe me anything," I said. "I do," he said. "I should have called you sooner. I wanted to wait until I had this in my hand. The probate clerk released it to me yesterday morning. I am sorry it took as long as it did. I am especially sorry for what I understand has been happening in your community in the meantime." I did not know what to say. I sat there with my hands on the leather arms of the chair, and I waited. "Your mother," he said, "was, as you know, a careful woman. She was careful in a way that, frankly, made my job easier and, at the same time, considerably harder." He smiled, very faintly, at the desk. "She came to see me in the autumn of 2019. October, I believe, the 14th. She drove herself into town. She was 68 years old. She had just received a preliminary diagnosis from her cardiologist that she did not yet wish to share with her family. She told me she wanted to make some changes." Changes to what? To her existing will. The will of 2016. I had known about the 2016 will. We had all known about the 2016 will. It was the document my sister had, in fact, been waving around at the wake, or rather claiming I had stolen. It had been a fairly conventional document. It had divided the estate evenly between my sister and me, with the vineyard land held in joint tenancy and a complicated mechanism for buying out, and it had been drafted, signed, and witnessed in this office in the spring of 2016. "Your mother," he said, "had become concerned, in the years between 2016 and 2019, about a pattern of behavior she had begun to observe in your sister. I will not go into all of it now. There will be time for that. But she had documented by 2019 3 specific incidents that satisfied her, in her own mind, that the original 2016 division was no longer appropriate." 3 incidents. Yes. Of what? He looked at me across the desk very steadily, and he said the word as gently as he could. "Fraud." I did not say anything. I think I made a small sound, but I do not remember it. "The first," he said, "involved a power of attorney document your sister attempted to have your mother sign in the autumn of 2017, which would have given her sole control of your mother's accounts. Your mother declined to sign. The second involved a check, in 2018, drawn on your mother's primary account, which your mother had not authorized. She elected, at the time, not to press charges, but she retained the canceled check and the bank's correspondence. The third, in the spring of 2019, was the use of your mother's signature, in your sister's hand, on a real estate document related to a parcel in Multnomah County that was not your mother's to convey. Your mother caught this last one before any harm was done. She came to see me the following week." He paused. He took a breath. He looked at the wax-sealed envelope on the felt blotter between us. "On the 14th of October, 2019, he said, Your mother executed a sealed codicil to her 2016 will. She executed it in this office. It was witnessed by two physicians, her cardiologist and her primary care doctor, both of whom were willing to testify, in writing on the day of the signing, that she was of sound and disposing mind. Their notarized affidavits are stapled to the codicil itself. The codicil was placed in this envelope, sealed with my office seal, registered with the Yamhill County probate clerk under a sealed instrument statute, and held by the clerk's office until her death. And the 2016 will. The 2016 will was formally revoked by the codicil. There is, however, a small complication. Your mother elected, against my advice, to keep a draft copy of the 2016 document in her wall safe at the farmhouse, marked with a red ink notation across the front page that read void and the date of revocation. She told me, at the time, that she wanted that copy in the safe so that if anything were ever produced from the safe by anyone other than herself, the marking would speak for itself. I stared at him. She knew. I believe, he said very gently, that she anticipated the possibility. Yes. I closed my eyes. I saw, suddenly and with a kind of awful clarity, my sister at the wake, holding up a handwritten document in front of my mother's pastor and my mother's cousins and the woman from the feed store, telling them about a will that had been stolen from a safe. I saw, behind my closed eyes, the red ink word void across the top of the first page. I opened my eyes. She produced the 2016 draft, I said, at the wake, or at least she's been telling people it exists, and that I took it. Yes. So, when she finally produces the document she's been hinting at, the one she says I stole, it will say void across the top in your mother's hand, with the date, October the 14th, 2019. And it will be a draft copy of a document that was formally revoked 7 years ago. I sat for a long moment in that quiet office with my hands on the leather arms of the chair, and I tried to understand what I was being told. I want to be honest about this part. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated. What I felt mostly was tired. A great, long, heavy tiredness, of the kind that builds up behind a dam, over 3 weeks and then lets go all at once. You said there was a codicil, I said finally. Yes. What does it say? He picked up the envelope. He turned it over in his thin, careful hands. He showed me the seal, a dark red wax disc with the impression of an old notary's stamp, and beneath it, in his own fountain pen hand, the date October 14th, 2019, and the word sealed instrument. Do not open until death of testator. He took a small letter opener from the drawer of the desk. He slid it under the wax. The seal cracked with a small, dry sound that I will remember for the rest of my life. He took out the document inside. It was 3 pages. It had been typed on his old IBM Selectric, he told me later, because my mother had not trusted laser-printed documents to age well. Each page was numbered in the lower right corner. Each page was initialed at the bottom in my mother's careful Catholic school hand. The signature page was at the back, and beneath my mother's signature there were 2 other signatures. A Dr. Halloway, my mother's primary care physician, and a Dr. Reyes, her cardiologist. And beneath each signature, in the careful red rubber stamp of a notary, the words sworn and witnessed this 14th day of October, 2019, the undersigned being satisfied that the testator is of sound and disposing mind. He set his tortoiseshell reading glasses on the desk. He cleared his throat. He read, I will not put the entire codicil into this telling. It was 3 pages. It was thorough. It was the work of a careful woman who had loved both her daughters and had been forced, by one of them, to make a choice. I will tell you what it said in the parts that mattered. It said that my mother, of sound and disposing mind, of her own free will, on the 14th day of October, in the year 2019, did hereby revoke, in its entirety, the will of 2016, and replaced it with the instrument now in his hands. It said that she named me sole executor of her estate. It said that she named me sole beneficiary of the 22 acres of vineyard land, the 1930s farmhouse, the weathered red barn, the equipment, the cellar, the standing crop, the 4 named brand assets, and the limited liability company through which the small commercial production of the estate was sold. It said, in a paragraph I want to read to you exactly, that the testator hereby disinherits her younger daughter from any share of the real property described above, on the grounds of a documented pattern of fraud against the testator's person and estate, the particulars of which are set forth in Schedule A, attached hereto. It said that it was the testator's express wish that this disinheritance not be construed as a withdrawal of love, but as an act of love taken on behalf of the property, the elder daughter, and the long-term integrity of the family land. It said, in the second-to-last paragraph, that should any party contest the codicil on grounds of undue influence or diminished capacity, the affidavits of the 2 attending physicians, witnessed at the signing, should be entered into the record as conclusive evidence to the contrary. It said, in the last paragraph, and this is the part where I finally cried, that the testator wished to communicate to her elder daughter that she had not been forgotten, that she had not been overlooked, that she had been seen and loved and trusted for the entire duration of her mother's life, and that the land was hers because she had earned it with her hands every day for 30 years, and because she would care for it, and because she would in time pass it on with the same care to whomever she chose. He folded the codicil. He folded it carefully along its original creases, and he set it back down on the felt blotter between us, and he took off his tortoiseshell glasses, and he set them down beside it, and he put his hand briefly across his eyes. I sat in that small, quiet office above 3rd Street, and I cried for a long time. Not loudly. I have never been a loud crier. I cried into my own hand the way I had cried in the cereal aisle at the grocery store, and the lawyer sat very quietly across from me and let me. And after a while he handed me a cotton handkerchief from his breast pocket without saying anything, and I used it, and I gave it back. "What happens now?" I said finally. "Now," he said, "I file the codicil with the probate court. I notify your sister's attorney. I provide the 2 physicians' affidavits and Schedule A to the court under seal. I anticipate, given the strength of the documentation, that any contest will be dismissed within 90 days. The 2016 draft, if produced, will be entered into evidence as a revoked instrument. The estate will be probated under the codicil. The land will be transferred to your name within 6 months. There will be some paperwork. There will be some difficult conversations. Your sister is unlikely to ever speak to you again." He paused. He looked at me across the desk. Me. "Are you all right with all of that?" he said. I thought about it for a long moment. "I am all right with all of it," I said, "except the last part. I understand. I would have given her the South Block. I would have given her a house. I would have given her any of it if she'd asked." "I know," he said. "Your mother knew too. That was, in part, why she did what she did. She did not want you to be the one who had to choose." I drove home from McMinnville that afternoon along the river road. The late August light was on the water. The vineyards on the far bank were beginning to turn at the edges, the first faint blush of rust in the leaves. I drove with both windows down and my elbow on the sill, and I did not turn the radio on. When I got home, my husband was in the kitchen making coffee. He took one look at my face, and he set down the carafe, and he came across the room, and he wrapped his arms around me without asking, and I stood there in his arms for a long time, with my forehead against his collarbone, and I told him, very simply, what the lawyer had read. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, in a voice very low and very quiet, "Your mother saw it, didn't she?" "She did," I said. "She saw all of it." The next 90 days were what the lawyer had said they would be. There were filings. There were notices. There was a brief, ugly hearing in the second week of September at which my sister's Portland attorney attempted to argue diminished capacity, and at which Dr. Halloway, my mother's primary care physician of 22 years, sat in the witness box in a navy cardigan and said, very evenly, that on the 14th of October in 2019, my mother had been one of the most lucid patients he had ever examined. The hearing took an hour and 20 minutes. The judge dismissed the contest from the bench. My sister did not look at me as she left the courtroom. She has not, in fact, looked at me since. I want to tell you about the people who came back, because it would be dishonest not to. The woman from the feed store called me on a Thursday afternoon in late September with a long, careful apology that was, I think, harder for her to make than it was for me to receive. My godfather drove out to the farmhouse on a Sunday in October with a casserole dish of his late wife's recipe for chicken and rice, and stood on the porch with his hat in his hand. My mother's cousin Doris wrote me a letter. They were good apologies, every one of them. I accepted them. I want to tell you that I accepted them with grace. I did not entirely. Something in me had been bruised in a place I did not know how to reach, and I think it will be bruised, in a small, quiet way, for the rest of my life. But the vines came back. That is the part I want to end on. The first frost was late that year. We did not get one until the second week of November, and the harvest came in clean and slow and good. We brought in the South Block on a Tuesday morning in October, with a crew of 6 and the fog still on the rows, and the grapes were dark and tight and cold, in the hand, and I stood at the head of row 12 at 6 in the morning with my breath showing white in the air, and I cried again, in a different way this time, because my mother had loved this exact moment of this exact morning every year for 40 years, and she was not in it, and she was in all of it. We had a good year. The wine, the lawyer told me later, was the best the estate had bottled in a decade. He said this over coffee in his office on a Wednesday in March. He had aged, I noticed, in the months since the codicil. There was a softness around his mouth that had not been there before. He told me that day that my mother had asked him, in 2019, when she had signed the codicil, to be sure that I knew she had been proud of me. He had been waiting, he said, for the right time to say it. I told him this was the right time. He nodded. He did not say anything else. A year went by, and I want to tell you what a year is in a place like this, because it is not what people who live in cities sometimes think it is. A year on a vineyard in the Willamette Valley is 12 weather conversations in a row. It is November pruning in the cold rain, with your hands so stiff inside your work gloves that the secateurs feel like an extension of someone else's arm. It is the slow, heavy sleep of the vines through January and February, when the rows look bare and brown and almost dead from the porch, and you remember every spring of your life that they are not dead, and you trust that they are not dead this spring either. It is bud break in the 3rd week of March, when the small pale green tips first push through the bark of the canes, and you walk the rows with your mother's voice in your head, saying, "We made it, sweetheart." It is the long, careful dance of frost protection in the 1st week of April, when you stay up until 2 in the morning, watching the temperature on the small digital sensor in the south block and praying it does not drop below 28. It is flowering in late May, the small white blooms appearing along the green shoots, the air faintly sweet at 5 in the morning. It is fruit set in early June, the tiny green pearls forming where the flowers were. It is veraison in the 1st week of August, the slow miracle by which the green pearls turn dark, one row at a time, until the whole vineyard is the color of a deep summer evening. It is harvest. It is crush. It is press. It is the long quiet of the cellar from October through the following April, with the bottles aging in their slow, dark patience. And then it is bottling day, when you bring in the small portable bottling line, and you and the 2 seasonal hands work for 9 hours, and at the end of the day, there are 1,100 bottles of the previous year's wine on the pallet outside the cellar door, and your husband brings out 3 glasses, and you stand there in the gravel turnaround, with the August light slanting low, and you toast. That is a year. That exactly was the year that passed. It was, against all expectation, the best year of my working life. I do not say that to be dramatic. I say it because it is the truth. With the contest dismissed in the 2nd week of September, and the codicil filed with the probate court, and the land being slowly transferred into my name through the long, careful machinery of Oregon estate law, something settled inside my chest that had not been settled for a long time, and I had not even known it had been unsettled. I slept differently. I worked differently. I noticed things in the South Block I had not noticed in years. The particular angle of the morning sun on the leaves of row 8 at 6:15 in October, the slight depression in the gravel turnaround where the truck had worn down a wheel track over 30 years, the small wild rose vine that had come up at the southern corner of the cellar door and that nobody had planted. I noticed the meadowlark. I noticed the way my husband moved through the rows beside me. I noticed one afternoon in February that I had been humming. I had not hummed in 3 years. The lawyer and I had lunch twice that year, once in November and once in March, both times at the small Italian place on 3rd Street that had been there for 40 years. He told me, both times, small, careful stories about my mother that I had not heard before. He told me, in November, about a cold week in the autumn of 1979, when the 2 of them had driven down to Eugene in his old Ford pickup to interview for a research grant my mother had eventually won, and how she had read out loud to him from a book of essays the entire way, because she had said, in her practical Catholic school way, that long drives were better with words in them. He told me in March that on the day she had signed the codicil, she had stood at the window of his office for a long time, looking down at 3rd Street, and she had said, very quietly, "Please be sure she knows, when the time comes, that I knew the difference." He had asked her, the difference between what? She had said, the difference between the daughter who deserved my house and the daughter who did not. He had said, all right. She had said again, please be sure. He had said, I will. Then she had picked up his fountain pen, and she had signed. I want to tell you, while I have the chance, about something I did in the 2nd week of December, 2 months after the contest was dismissed, That may give you the wrong impression of me, but that I am going to tell you anyway, because it was true. I drove down to Portland on a gray, rainy Wednesday afternoon in my husband's truck, and I parked across the street from the building where my sister lived. I sat in the cab for 40 minutes with the engine off and the heater going down. I had no plan. I do not know even now what I thought I was going to do. I had a folded piece of paper in my coat pocket on which I had, the night before at our kitchen table, written 4 sentences. I had thought I might give them to her. I had thought I might leave them under her door. I had thought I might put them in her mailbox. The 4 sentences said this: I am sorry that what happened between us happened. I am sorry that I cannot give you any of the land, because Mom did not give me that choice. I am willing, at any point in the future, to talk. The door is not locked. I sat in the cab for 40 minutes and I watched the lobby of her building through the rain. I watched 2 delivery couriers come and go. I watched an older woman with a small white dog walk past. I watched the porter inside the lobby fold a newspaper and set it down. My sister never appeared. I do not know if she was even home. After 40 minutes, I started the truck and I drove back up the U5 through the rain to the valley. And on the long, flat stretch outside Wilsonville, I rolled the window down a few inches, and I tore the 4 sentences out of the cab, and I let the wind take them. I am not proud of having torn them up. I am not proud of having driven down. But I am, in some small way, glad I went, because I want my own conscience to know, when I am 80 years old, and walking these rows with a stick, that I drove down to Portland on a rainy Wednesday in December, and I sat for 40 minutes, and I tried. She has not, as I said, contacted me since. Her 2 children did eventually, in their own time. The 2nd August came, and the second wake of August was hot and dry and golden, and the vines were heavy on the wires, and the late afternoon light was the way it had been on the day of the wake, only without the casseroles and without the silence. I was in the South Block at golden hour. I had on the same brown leather work boots, a little dustier, a little more scuffed at the toes. I had on the same faded denim jacket. The silver wedding band was still on its chain at my throat. My hair, more gray now than auburn, was pulled back in the same low ponytail. I had a pair of secateurs in my back pocket and a single bunch of dark Pinot Noir grapes in my right hand, cut from a vine at the head of row 8 that my father had planted in 1975, and I was walking the row slowly, the way my mother used to walk it, listening to the sound of the leaves, looking for any vine that did not look like the others. I heard the gravel first. I turned. There was a small gray hatchback parked at the end of the row, on the shoulder of the gravel turnaround, and there were 2 young people standing beside it. A young woman in her early 20s, with her mother's ash-blonde hair, grown out long now and pulled into a braid over one shoulder. A young man, slightly older, in his early 20s as well, in a flannel shirt and jeans. They were my sister's children. I had not seen them in a year. They did not come down the row. They stood at the end of it, with the late golden light behind them, and they waited. The young woman had her hands clasped in front of her at her waist, the way a child waits to be called on. The young man had his hands in his pockets. I walked up the row toward them with the bunch of grapes in my hand. When I was within a few feet of them, the young woman said my name, very softly, and then she said, "We wanted to come," and then she stopped. "It's okay," I said. "We wanted to come a long time ago." "It's okay." "Mom didn't," she said, and then she stopped again, and her eyes filled, and she looked down at her hands. We didn't know what was true. For a long time, we didn't know what was true. And then we did, and we didn't know how to come. The young man looked at me steadily over his sister's shoulder. His eyes were her eyes, pale blue, sharp, but the expression in them was something else entirely, something tired and careful and very young. "I am sorry," he said simply, "for what was said about you, for what we believed. I am sorry." I did not cry that time. I had done my crying at the head of row 12, in the fog the previous October, and I had done my crying in the lawyer's office above 3rd Street, and I had done my crying at the kitchen island the night of the wake. I was, in this moment, dry-eyed and steady and 49 years old, and I was standing in a row of vines that my mother had given me on the 14th of October in 2019 because she had seen, more clearly than anyone, what was coming. "Come down to the cellar," I said quietly. "I want to show you something." They followed me down the row and across the gravel and around the side of the weathered red barn to the cellar door cut into the slope of the hill. I unbolted the door. I led them down the 3 stone steps into the cool, dim space below, where the racks of the previous year's bottles stood in their slow, patient rows, and I took down a single bottle from the top of the second rack, a bottle from the South Block, vintage of the year my mother had died, and I set it on the small wooden table at the bottom of the steps, and I told them the story. I told them about the wake. I told them about the safe. I told them about the 3 weeks of silence and the locked doors of the farmhouse. I told them about the call from the lawyer on a Tuesday afternoon. I told them about the wax-sealed envelope on the felt blotter and the 2 doctors' signatures on the last page of the codicil and the red ink word, void, across the top of the document their mother had been claiming I had stolen. I told them what their grandmother had asked me to know. They listened without interrupting. When I finished, the young woman put her hand on the bottle on the table, very lightly, with 2 fingers, the way her grandmother used to put her hand on a thing she loved. "Can we come back?" she said. "Yes." "Like more than once?" "Yes." The young man cleared his throat. He looked around the cellar. He looked at the rows of bottles, at the dark stone walls, at the small high window where the late golden light was coming in across the rafters. "What do you need help with?" he said. I looked at him. I looked at his sister. I looked at the bunch of grapes in my hand from the vine my father had planted in 1975, and I felt, for the first time in a year, the slow, soft return of something I had not known how much I had been missing. "Tying canes in the South Block," I said. "First thing in the morning, 6 o'clock, bring boots." They came at 6 o'clock. They are still coming. I walked the rows alone that evening at golden hour after they had driven away in the small gray hatchback, with their windows down and their hands lifted in the rearview mirror. The vines were heavy and good. The light was on the leaves. I walked to the head of row 8, and I stood for a long time looking down the long, slow line of vines toward the creek. And I thought about my mother at 68 years old, driving herself into McMinnville on a Monday in October to put her name on 3 pages of typewriter paper in a small office above a stationery store. And I thought about her sitting at this kitchen island in the spring of her diagnosis, sliding a piece of folded notepaper across the wood with 2 thin trembling fingers, and saying, "Only you, sweetheart, only you." She had known. She had seen all of it. She had loved both of her daughters, and she had been forced, by one of them, to choose. And she had chosen, 3 years before she died, in a small office above 3rd Street, with 2 doctors as her witnesses, in red ink and dark wax, and her own careful Catholic school cursive, and she had sealed the choice in an envelope and given it to a man who had loved her since 1972, and she had asked him to hold it for her until the day came when it was needed. The day had come. The land was mine. I stood at the head of row 8 in the last of the golden light with a single bunch of dark grapes in my hand, and I said, very quietly, into the warm August air, "Thank you, Mom." The leaves moved on the wires. The light went down behind the western ridge, a long, slow gold turning to rose. And I walked, in my dusty work boots, back up the row toward the house, through the rows my father had planted, through the rows my mother had walked every August for 40 years, through the rows that would, in time, when I was ready, pass from my hand to whichever of those two young people had earned the keeping of them. The wraparound porch light was on, soft and amber, behind the dark green shutters of the 1930s farmhouse, and my husband was on the porch with 2 glasses of the South Block wine, and the kitchen window was open, and the meadowlark was still singing somewhere far off in the South Block, and the August evening smelled the way it had smelled every August of my life, of dust and warm grape leaves, and the faint faraway sweetness of wisteria climbing the south corner of the house my mother had left me. I walked up the porch steps. I sat down beside my husband. I took the glass he handed me. We did not say anything for a long time. We just watched the last of the gold go out of the sky over the vines. That, in the end, is the whole of it. My mother had seen. My mother had chosen. My mother had sealed the choice and given it to a man she trusted, 3 years before she died, against the day when the choice would be needed. The day had come, and the seal had been broken, and the land had come home to the hand that had cared for it for 30 years. And a year later, at golden hour, 2 young people had stood at the end of a row of vines and asked very quietly if they could come back. I had said yes. I will always say yes. The vines are heavy this morning. The fog is on the rows. The harvest will be in next week. There is a small gray hatchback parked at the end of the gravel turnaround, and there are 2 young people in flannel shirts and dusty boots tying up canes at the head of row 12, and my mother's farmhouse is behind me with its dark green shutters and its single warm amber light burning in the upstairs window, and the wax seal of an envelope I will keep, for the rest of my life, in the locked drawer of the roll-top desk in the spare bedroom, was broken on a Thursday morning in September of last year by a kind old man with gray-blue eyes and a fountain pen clipped to his breast pocket. And I am today exactly where my mother always knew I would be, at the head of the row, in my own boots, on my own land, with my own hands, at golden hour.